So welcome to Romans chapter 3. There's 3 parts to this chapter, and this is part 1. So if you've been following along, you'll remember that Paul just got done basically condemning everyone. He was talking to the barbarians. These are the uncultured Gentiles, and making the point that they are guilty before God and they have no excuse because they should be able to look at the creation and see that there's a God that they're accountable to. And then he talked about the Greeks. These are the cultured Gentiles. And he made the point that, hey, listen, they're guilty too. They practice the same things that they would say are wrong, and they have the conscience, which is a moral guide, that they go against. And then he addressed the Jews, and he said, okay, the Jews, they have the laws of God, and they've broken those, so everybody is under sin. And so now what he's going to do in this first section of Romans is he is going to anticipate some objections that a Jewish person might have to what he is teaching, that both Jews and Gentiles are under sin and guilty before God. So let's go ahead and read that. Then what advantage has the Jew, or what is the benefit of circumcision? Great in every respect. First of all, that they were entrusted with the oracles of God. What then? If some did not believe, their unbelief will not nullify the faithfulness of God, will it? May it never be. Rather, let God be found true, though every man be found a liar, as it is written, that thou may be justified in your words and prevail when you are judged. But if our unrighteousness demonstrates the righteousness of God, what shall we say? The God who inflicts wrath is not unrighteous, is he? I'm speaking in human terms. May it never be, for otherwise how will God judge the world? But if through my lie the truth of God abounded to his glory, why am I still being judged as the sinner? And why not say, as we are slanderously reported, and as some claim that we say, let us do evil that good may come? Their condemnation is just. What then? Are we better than they? Not at all. For we have already charged that both Jews and Greeks are all under sin. Okay, so what did all that mean? Well, to understand this, you have to remember that Paul is kind of conducting an imaginary conversation between himself and a Jewish person that might object to his teaching that both Jews and Gentiles are guilty before God. So here's how we're going to do this. This is going to be Paul speaking when I'm dressed like this. And this is going to be the objector speaking, a Jewish person that might object to some of Paul's teachings here. So, Paul, what advantage has the Jew then? If both Jews and Gentiles are guilty before God, why is it beneficial at all to be Jewish? Well, it's beneficial to be Jewish, first of all, because the Jews were given the oracles of God. They were given the scripture. They were given the prophecies about the Messiah. It's just that when it comes to salvation, the Jews don't have an advantage over the Gentiles. Okay, Paul, I guess that's an advantage, but the Jews were unfaithful to God. So therefore, the promises he made in the oracles of God or in the word in the Old Testament, they're null and void. Certainly, God isn't going to come through on his promises when Israel was unfaithful. So really, it's not an advantage to have the oracles of God or the Old Testament scriptures. No, that's definitely not the case. Even though Israel was unfaithful to God, God's promises still stand. He will be faithful to his promises despite Israel's unfaithfulness. God will always be true and faithful to his promises, even though mankind is unrighteous and unfaithful to him. Okay, that makes sense, but if Israel has been unfaithful and sinned against God, and he has been faithful, well, that makes God look really good. He looks very gracious and compassionate and faithful despite Israel's failure. So if Israel's sin is making him look good, how could he punish Israel? I mean, they're making him look good. It's not really fair that they get punished for that. Well, if you carry that out to its logical conclusion, then God couldn't judge anybody because everybody sins, and therefore they're making him look good and glorious. So that doesn't make sense. Also, that kind of thinking leads to the idea of doing evil so that God's goodness might be shown. So now doing evil has become a good thing. So that doesn't make sense. And some actually accuse me, Paul, of teaching that it's okay to do evil, that good may come, of which I do not teach, and those that say that, their condemnation is just, because that is not true. Now, here's the point. It is an advantage to be Jewish. They've been given the oracles of God, and even though they have rebelled, God is faithful to his promises in the Old Testament to Israel. However, that advantage has nothing to do with salvation. The Jews are guilty just like the Gentiles. It is beneficial to be Jewish, but not when it comes to salvation. Both are under sin. Both are guilty before God. So what's the main idea here? Basically, Paul's saying that Jews and Gentiles are both under sin, and he's addressing these objections that a Jewish person could bring to challenge that main point that he has. So let's think about application. What kind of objections might you have to this idea that we're all guilty before God and we deserve separation from him forever? For example, certainly some people are better than others. I mean, how can somebody who's a decent citizen that, takes good care of their family and works a job and contributes to a society be just as guilty as somebody who was a murderer? Or what about those that have never heard? How could they possibly be guilty when they've never heard of God or Jesus or salvation or the gospel or anything? Or you might think, I've suffered a lot. God kind of owes me a little bit. I mean, I've really had some hard times. Certainly, he should accept me because I'm a decent person, even though I've been hurt. Now, these are all really good questions, and I think it's worth it to think about these things. However, to use them as objections to the idea that we're guilty and we rightly deserve God's judgment is really not acceptable. So think about some of the objections or struggles that you might have. Find the answers to them, yes, but don't use them as objections or reasons to dismiss the reality that you desperately need his forgiveness and his salvation.